very often arrived a bit later than in other zones. So now in terms of offer, we'll go and have a look at what it looks like. But just before this, some figures about the economics of broadcasting. In the upper part of this slide, you have what it looked like before going digital. There were 6 channels, 6 analog channels in France, 3 of them which had been launched very early in time. They were the original public service broadcasting channels, 1, 2, 3. They had a very extensive broadcasting stations network, more than 3,500. They covered, of course, near to 99% of population, but with a very high broadcasting cost, which was of about 60 million euros per year per channel for the whole of France. Then on the right side, there were three more recent analog channels which were launched in the 80s. Their network was less extended, with of course a cost which was a bit less high, but still, as you can see, it was around 30 million euros per year and per channel. And now, after DTT was launched, so since 2005, we have about 1,600 broadcasting stations, so we cut by more than 2 the number of stations that the historical channels, analog channels, had. And then we have the multiplexing effect, so that we drop, the costs drops down to about 6 million euros per year per channel. So it's almost a tenfold factor for the historical analog channels that were first launched. So going from 60 million euros to about 6 million euros per year, which is really significant for them. Of course, this is after simulcast is finished. In the first period, you had to add up both costs. So, as I just said, let's talk about the offer. This is the way the offer looks right now. Actually, in 2005, it was not exactly like this, because, as I said, pay TV channels were launched afterwards. And what also was launched afterwards was, as you can see, high-definition HD channels. So today, this is what the landscape we have on DTT in France. We have 20 free-to-air channels, 8 pay TV channels, and 11 high-definition channels. 6 of them actually were launched quite recently. They were launched, these last two multiplexes, 7 and 8, at this end of the slide. They were launched in December last year. So we have enhanced the audiovisual landscape as years went. And these are the national channels, but there was also an opportunity to launch more local TV channels. Actually, in France, we didn't have so many of them, and DTT was really an opportunity for them to get a new start or a new revival. At least technically speaking, the possibility was there. As you can see here, on the first multiplex on the left-hand side, you have a slot here for a local channel everywhere in France. So, well, this is the way it looks right now. We have about 50 local channels on DTT. We have them here all over the French territory. It was quite important, politically speaking, actually, to also put forward the fact that on the local level, you could have TVs on the regional level or even on the level of individual cities. This was something quite appealing for local representatives to be aware of this. Even though, actually, I have to say, the technical feasibility we have here on DTT doesn't solve the economical problem, the problem of business model for these channels. And to be clear, in France, this problem is still a very hard one. They really struggle, and several of them, well, disappeared in the past years, because it's really hard for local channels, in our environment at least, to find a viable business model. So what about now the access to TV? As you see, this shows how DTT was taken up by the general public. So of course in 2005 it started in 0. After 2 years we were at about 16%. 16% of people accessing DTT, but you have to remember that at that time the coverage was not so extensive. The coverage was about 70% of the population, so 16% were actually accessing DTT, and then the slope was, well, really quite steep, and this stops in 2011, and at that time already more than 60% of the population was having DTT at home. And at the same time, the main alternative access modes to television, which are cable and satellite, in fact, didn't move so much. What improved, on the other hand, was TV over DSL, IPTV, which was launched a bit before DTT in France in 2003, and which also now is really the second access mode to TV. This shows, anyway, that DTT was a success, clearly, but that also triple play offers, including TV over DSL, were also a big success, because these offers were really quite attractive and cheap for customers, allowing to access TV, telephone, and the internet in one bundle. But DTT definitely remains, and by far, the leading access mode to television. This shows the evolution of the audience shares of the main TV channels since DTT was launched. So these are the individual channels, 1, 2, 3, 6, 5. Okay, this is the classical order we have in France, because this is the order in which they have been launched. Well, as you could expect, the historical analog channels saw their audiences decrease year after year. And really the new DTT channels, which are here figured in gray, of course started 0, and well, after about 5 or 6 years, were already at 22% of audience share, which is really quite significant. At the beginning, really, or before the launch, or in the very beginning, high concerns were expressed about, well, these channels will have small budgets and they will never be attractive and they will never succeed. Well, what you can observe now, after 6 years return of experience, is that the previous channel, the historical channels, still are dominant, but that really these new channels now are having a significant weight in the audiovisual landscape in France. And this also led, of course, to an increased offer of programs and a more diverse offer of programs. So this was a quick overview on the process of launching DTT in France. And now let's go to the second part, which is how did we prepare and actually perform the digital switchover. Here again, I propose to start with the legislative framework we put in place, and then to have a look at how actually this happened. So again, this all started with a law called Television of the Future, which also set up the main principles for the digital switchover. And the first thing that was that before considering switching over, well, the coverage should be at a high level enough, because it was not possible to envisage a switchover where, for instance, only 90% of the population would be covered. This was really not enough, and deputies or senators in the French Parliament were very looking this from very closely, and the debate for the law was really hard on this point. And the outcome was that by law, the coverage of DTT should extend to at least 95% of the population. And this was mandatory for the analog channels, the first channel, the channels which were broadcast in analog. And for the new DTT channels, they had to cover a minimum of 91% by law, but but they had incentives if they go, so that they would be keen on going to 95, so that they would then have their licenses be renewed for a longer time. And they actually all opted for this. They all committed themselves to a minimum of 95% coverage, which was the aim, in fact, of the law here. Another point was that, okay, 95% is good. What about the remaining 5%? Of course, it was out of question that they wouldn't have access to these to this offer, to the DTT channels. So the law provided that subscription-free satellite bundle, satellite offer, should be made up with a bundle of all DTT free-to-air channels, so that everywhere on the territory, all the people could access all the free-to-air channels. Then, of course, talking about switchover is talking about a date, and it was from the beginning, okay, there was a debate, should we set up now a date or should we be more flexible? There were pros and cons for both choices, and finally we opted, or the Parliament opted for setting up a very precise date, 30th of November 2011. And well, it was actually quite a gamble because at that time, I should say, not so many people thought that we would stick to the date. It was actually not so easy to do it. We will see how we did, but finally the date was respected. The next principle was that the digital switchover would be done progressively, region by region. And the schedule of this, the order of the regions, first regions, etc., would be decided by the CSA, which is the regulator. And there should be enough visibility on the schedule so that the CSA, the law says, should decide about switching over a certain region and publicly announce it at least 9 months ahead, 9 months in advance. Another very, very important thing from the organizational point of view was that a public grouping was set up. We will see what it consisted in to really, from the operational point of view, carry out all operations. And the last point, which was the most controversial, was to grant another bonus channel to each private channel after its analog switch off. And this was again because these incumbent players were really, really not so cooperative in the whole process, were again trying to delay the process, even though they had more costs because of the simulcast, but they were also interested in keeping their influence, in keeping their power on the market, and therefore they wanted the switchover to be, in fact, quite well as late as possible. Where you could have thought that it would be the contrary because of direct financial costs. Well, it was not the case. So this second bonus channel was a way to, in a way, buy their cooperation in the process, without which we couldn't have managed. This is not finished. There were lots of things to put into this law. There was a set of prescriptions about the protection and help for viewers. We'll come back in more detail on this, but one key point was all the buildings where there were renters, people rented their apartments, and how should they be informed by the tenants. So there were, okay, very precise prescriptions about this. Another key point was to progressively have DTT tuners put into TV sets which were sold. So from a certain date, DTT tuners should be in all sold TV sets, otherwise it was not legal. And this was really key so that the population would take up, well, with digital, and so that after a few years, quite naturally, in fact, with the renewal of TV sets, and enough people amongst the population already had digital. This was really very important. And finally, there was a help scheme which was set up for low-income viewers, so that if it was really too hard for them to acquire the tuners, the digital tuners, they would have a sum of money for this. There was a provision about digital dividend, and we'll come back later to it. And last but not least, there were provisions for launching later high-definition TV and mobile TV. high definition worked quite well. As you could see, we now have more than 10 high definition channels. Mobile TV didn't work at all. So this was the law which was about digital switchover, but it was not finished. It was not finished because this legislative framework, which, as you could see, was quite extensive, was not sufficient. What very quickly we could see was that it was hard to reach the targets of coverage, because coverage means costs. For the broadcasters, and they didn't necessarily have an interest in paying these costs, because when you come to a 90% coverage or a 93% coverage, while covering 1 extra % of the population is very expensive and doesn't bring so many viewers or so many advertising revenue. So, and the incentives they had was not enough. So it was decided in this other law the year after that the CSA, the regulator, could publish a mandatory list of DTT broadcasting stations that had to be put in operation by all the channels, and also on the dates where they should be switched on, because otherwise the process just didn't go quickly enough, and it wouldn't have been possible to hold the switch-off date. So this proved to be necessary. The year after, we also had a few other legislative prescriptions in another law, which was not primarily about this, but it was the occasion to have this. One thing was that there was a second free satellite offer with a bundle with all the channels. And another far more important thing was that the local executives, such as cities or departments or regions, could ask themselves for their own broadcasting stations. The idea there was that, well, with the mandatory broadcasting station that the CSA had decided on, published the list, you could reach 95% of the population, which was respecting the law and which was good from a macro perspective. But from a local perspective, well, some cities, small cities, for instance, were not happy about this, and they were ready to pay themselves at least a fraction of the cost for setting up their own additional broadcasting stations, a local broadcasting station, so that in these small cities or even villages, the people would have DTT and wouldn't have to switch to satellite, for instance. So this was really it was not an economically rational choice, probably, but it was really politically necessary to have this provision. And you may say, okay, that's it. Well, that was not it, because in 2009 there was it was really a tough period for the process, and clearly there came a time where you could see that it could have failed if we hadn't had this additional, but it's the final one, be reinsured, this additional law, which was voted at the end of 2009. It was actually an initiative from the parliament. It was a draft law coming from the parliament, not from the government, but then backed by the government. And this is a set of final prescriptions that enabled to actually be successful at the end of the day. The first one was that it granted more power to the CSA for really imposing not only the list and dates of switch on for the broadcasting stations, but also the power levels of these stations. Because otherwise, again, the channels, the multiplexes tried to pay a little less and didn't push enough the powers, so the coverage was not the one it should have been. So more power to the CSA, and then it could really impose these power levels. Then we come back to local entities, cities, etc. They wanted to be more involved in the process. So local commissions were created to follow up the process. In each département in France we have, which are the local administrative organizations. We have about 100 départements in France. So there were 100 local commissions which were created and put in place so that all the mayors and the local executives could have their say or could have a good vision of the process. Then some funding was provided also by the government to local executives in order to contribute to their own broadcasting stations in the case where they wanted to put one. So it went even further than the previous provision. Another really decisive provision was to strengthen the help scheme for the people who were living in zones which at the end of the day would not be covered by DTT. And there, what was initially foreseen was that these people could have a help, but only if they had a certain revenue. For people with a high revenue, they should buy it themselves. And what was decided there was that whatever the revenue of the people in these specific zones, they could have this help to go for the satellite. This really wasn't obvious from the beginning, but it was necessary so that the local, the people, the elected people there in these regions, which are mountain regions or this kind of regions, would really back the process. Two last things. The last but one was that for old people or impaired people for which it was more difficult to cope up with the thing, free support should be granted and should be organized. And well, the last thing was something, of course, which is linked to the shape of the French territory. All what I've been talking about was in mainland France, and this last provision was about launching digital terrestrial television in the overseas territories of France, in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Pacific Ocean, where, okay, obviously the situation was very different from the economic perspective, but still there was a willingness to launch DTT in these territories. That was it. So as you can see, really the legislative framework was quite extensive, and also it was not done in one stage only. It was really well, a progressive process, and also a bit a trial and error process, or at least a process where we saw what we needed extra in order to ensure success. And if we hadn't passed these additional laws or pieces of legislation, most probably the process, well, would have failed, or at least would have been delayed for some years. So now let's come to the more concrete organizational points. I talked about the first law setting up what is called a public interest grouping, groupement d'intérêt public, which is an entity gathering the state and the national analog channel, which were to be switched off. And all these people had to work together and had to fund the main operations of coordination of the process, which were information for the whole public about the dates of the switchover, about the process, about very concretely speaking what people should do, what they should buy, how they should plug, etc. So there was a quite extensive communication campaign, both on the national and regional levels. Which was the first task of this France Télé Numérique body. The second task was to coordinate all operations, also on the, in all respects, technicians, officials, associations, all organizations on the local field to coordinate their operations. So they had headquarters in Paris, in the capital city, but they had to have people in each region, and of course this followed the schedule of the switch off on the territory. And the last big task of this body, France Télé Numérique, was to manage the health scheme and the technical assistance for old people. So all this help scheme was managed by France Télé Numérique. So this was really the key actor in the concrete tasks within this process. To give an overview on who did what in the public sector about this. So first the parliament and the government designed the law, the decrees, the national plan for switchover with the dates, as you could see. They designed and funded the help scheme and communication campaigns. And as we just saw, the government funded 50% of all the rest of the expenses of France Télé Numérique, of this body. The regulator, the CSA, had more technical tasks in terms of frequencies, negotiations with neighboring countries, in terms of defining the frequency plan for the whole territory. In terms of, as we saw, deciding the dates for the switch off and working on the coverage maps, which was really something very hard, but this is what they had to perform. And as we saw, they had to impose these coverage levels to the broadcasters and to the multiplexes. And finally, we had this France Télénumérique body gathering the government and the analog channels, and which performed these three tasks: information, help scheme, and operational driving of the process with all the local stakeholders. So this is how it went. I'm not going to go into the detail. What you see on the left-hand side is the list of the regions and the dates of switchover for each of the individual regions. What maybe I could say about this is first that even before the first region that you can see at the end of 2009, there were some pilots, and this proved quite important in terms of getting organized and learning what to do and what not to do. So the first time the switchover started with a first pilot in a small city with about 10,000 inhabitants. So this was really something easy to manage and to see how to do things, how to inform, etc. A second pilot was done with a bigger city with about 200,000 inhabitants. And then was the first actual region, and this was another level. It was about 2 million inhabitants. And then it could roll out and roll out smoothly, I have to say. Just another consideration about the order, the criteria for choosing the order of the regions. This was based on two main factors. One factor was, again, this willingness to go step by step. So we started with not too big regions, and for instance, Paris and its region were only switched off rather to the end of the process, not completely to the end, but rather after the middle. And the other factor for deciding was that, there were constraints of sharing frequencies, so really technical constraints in the spectrum management. So it meant that you couldn't do it just in any order. The final thing was that before switching off, you needed to reach enough coverage. And as I said before, especially in the south of France, we have many mountain regions, so they needed many more transmitters, and this took time. So you had to let time first for the transmitters to be put in place, to have enough coverage, and then finally you could switch off in this part of the territory, which was done in the last year, in 2011. The last thing I can say about this is that, okay, this is the final result, but before coming to this, there were really intensive discussions amongst, of course, the CSA, which could decide on it, but they were subject to many, many pressures from all the regions, for all the local executives. Okay, this was again quite a tough process to arrive there. And even when after, for instance, reaching the end of the first year, 2010, there were still discussions on the order, some regions saying, no, we're not ready, we want to go later, etc. But finally, it was held, and the target date was respected. We ended on the 29th of November, which was exactly, one day before the day set by law. Just a small zoom on the help scheme. There were actually three parts. One part was designed especially for low-income households, and so it depended really on their income, and then they were entitled to ask, to request for help for purchasing the set-top box. So this was not a very big amount, but for really low-income people, it was deemed necessary to put this help in place. And in some cases, they not only needed to have a DTT set-top box, but they also needed to have an upgrade or a change in their antenna, in their aerial, and then they could have a higher help, about 120 euros, because it's just more expensive to have this done by a professional specialist. The second part was for people aged more than 70 years old, and this, as I said, included really a free service where you have people going to their home, and spend 10 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour with them to really help them understand how to plug and how to handle the devices, scan the channels, etc. And the last part was the one I was talking about before. It was added in the second stage in 2009, the last law which was passed, and it was for all the residents which were out of DTT coverage, and they were entitled to the full subsidy, enabled them to switch to satellite when it was necessary, even if they had a high income level. So this was really a political decision. So that in all regions people were helped, even in mountains or in a very rural area where DTT could not come because it would really have been too expensive. A few figures, general figures about the switch off. So this process, as you saw, lasted 2 years, from end 2009 to end 2011. The total costs for the state was about 156 million euros, 100 million euro borne by the state, and then the rest was borne by the public and private channels which were switching off, so the analog channels. I have to be precise to say that this cost was really the cost of the switchover itself. It doesn't include the cost of building the network. It's really something which is distinguished. Just for you to have an idea, this cost, so 150 million euros, in the beginning when it was planned in 2009, the forecast was to have a cost of more than 300,000. So finally it was much less expensive than foreseen. And this was, amongst other things, because finally less people than anticipated claimed the helps for the help scheme. There were, of course, helps claimed, but not as much as had been thought originally. In terms of communication, I was talking about, of course, national advertising campaigns. It was quite massive, and there were several phases of advertising campaigns. There was a dedicated call centers, phone call centers that were set up for the whole period and received, as you can see, several million phone calls by people just wanting to know how it works, when it would be, what they should do not to lose TV access, etc. Website, of course. A massive number of leaflets which were distributed throughout the country, 30 million leaflets. We have in France 60 million inhabitants, so one leaflet for 2 inhabitants. This was the objective, was really to have everyone informed about the process. And at the same time, there was a monitoring that was put in place on the awareness of people on the whole process, and also on their equipment, their actual equipment with DTT. So we could see, globally speaking, and also in every region, how the process was going on. And we could also adjust then the intensity or the modalities of the communication to the different regions. The last words are on the on-site assistance for elderly people. 500,000 on-site interventions at home for them. And this was done, amongst others, by students or people which were doing this for free, just to help. So this was, of course, organized by France Télé Numérique, this public-private body, but there were quite a number of people, especially students, who came and volunteered to do so and to help elderly people. And a last word about what I talked about, which was this possibility for local executives, like local cities, to put in place their own broadcasting stations. Well, this was actually used. As you can see, 350 broadcasting stations were put in place under this provision, and the state the government contributed to about a third of the cost for these stations. So it was, in fact, at the end of the day, not really expensive for the government, but it proved key in having the support of the parliament and of the executives, and finally doing this whole thing. A few words about the digital dividend. So the law in 2007 had a specific provision about this. First, it set up a parliamentary commission specific to this, so that the parliament would have its say in this, and so that it would not be only the government decided on this, on how much of the digital dividend would be allocated to audiovisual, TV, and to the telecom. So finally, like in the rest of Europe, the outcome was that this 790, 862 megahertz band was made free for the telecom. But there was actually an important debate in the parliament and in the government, with lots of people heard and having their say in the process. Okay, probably I'll go quick on this one. So it is just about the allocation of this digital dividend. The main thing, in fact, is that it brought money to the state, which was one of the results, one of the expectations. This was more than 2.6 billion euros, which were paid by the three telecom operators, which you can see here, for then developing their 4G networks. A few words on the TV set market. I will not spend too much time on this. This goes back far in time, from the 70s. And what you can see is that, okay, the number of sales, annual sales of TV sets was rather slowly increasing until the years 2000 and something, and then sharply increasing. So this was really linked to two effects, which were that at the same time you have digital coming and you had flat screens coming to the market. And this was really a conjunction which was quite helpful, of course, for TV sellers, but also for the public authorities, because it's really helped to go quicker in people having digital access, because they were interested in having flat screen TV, which was fashionable, which was a new thing on the market. And at the same time, since the law provided that these new TV sets should have DTT decoders, then people were already digital, and this made the things really smoother and easier to perform the switchover after a few years. And of course, the last years were also quite important, because a number of people, when they really had to buy a DTT decoder, preferred to buy a new TV set, even though they knew that it was not mandatory, but they bought a new TV set, which was brand new with a flat screen, nice image, in some cases high definition already, and this really boosted the sales of TV sets during this whole period, and it made things possible for us. Okay, this is pretty much the same thing, all coming at the same time, DTT, switch off, flat screen, high definition, really a price decrease over the period, and nice figures for the sales, and nice outcome for the switchover. Just a few words about where we are now and the future of DTT in France, because this is not the end of the history, of course. As I said before, very recently we launched 2 new multiplexes with only high-definition channels. So we have 6 brand new high-definition channels which were launched about 7 months ago, plus the 4 channels we had before, so 11 HD channels. The idea is that within a few years, we don't know whether it will be 3 or 5 or 7 years, but probably all channels we have today on DTT will go for high definition. This will be the standard in a few years. So this is what is expected. And the other thing which is expected, we were talking about this morning, is that probably 4K is likely to be launched. At least it's viewed as a key attractiveness factor for DTT, and this for us should go along with a migration to the new standards. We are in DVB-T and PIC2 or just a part is in MPEG 4. What is right now under discussion in France is when and how we will migrate to DVB-T2 and at least MPEG 4 or HEVC directly. This is something that we are now discussing for two things. Again, for having a better and richer TV offer, and including 4K, and also for having a second digital dividend, because although the decision hasn't been formally made now, it is very, very probable that we will have this second digital dividend freed up for mobile, for telecoms, in the few years to come, probably in 5 or 6 years, and these 700 megahertz subband probably will be allocated to them. Now, the question we have and what we are working on in how to organize this in time, this technical migration, the launch of new services, and freeing up this part of the frequency band for the telecoms. And of course, this implies a number of problems. Today we have 8 multiplexes. If we reallocate the 700 megahertz band, we will have less bandwidth, less channels. No, we can't have less channels, of course. We cannot just switch off channels like this. So, of course, we will have better efficiency with the new technologies, but this is something that is not obvious to organize. So this is really our new challenge right now. I won't go to the details of this, but these are several potential scenarios for the future of DTT. We are now under DVB-T, MPEG 2, MPEG 4. Probably we will first switch off MPEG 2. Then we will launch somewhere in time DVB-T2, HEVC probably. When do we launch 4K? When do we switch off simple definition? Okay, these are open questions, but the target is what is here on the right of the slide. It is to be in DVB-T2 HEVC with high definition and 4K channels, and this will probably be somewhere in 8, 10, 12 years. We don't know yet exactly. This is what we have to prepare now for the future. And one key thing for us from the governmental perspective is, one, to free up these frequencies for mobile, because it is important to go further in mobile access to internet on the whole territory. But two, and it is as well as important as the first one, to preserve the DTT platform's attractiveness, because today it is still the platform number one to access TV for French people, and for a number of reasons we think that it should remain so. It should be this platform because it is a free, universal platform of accessing to TV for everyone with a good quality, and therefore it is very important from the political perspective, also from the audiovisual and cultural policies perspective, that DTT in the future remains the first platform and the most attractive platform for all stakeholders. So this is what we have to work on now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bakopsa, for the very fruitful presentation. ขอขอบคุณท่านวิทยากรเป็นอย่างสูงนะคะสำหรับหัวข้อในเซสชั่นต่อไปนะคะจะเป็นเรื่องของการออกอากาศภาคพื้นดินในระบบดิจิทัลและ DSO ที่ญี่ปุ่นรวมทั้งเทคโนโลยีของ UHTV ด้วยค่ะ We start the next session very shortly, and the topic of next session is the global presentation of digital terrestrial broadcasting and DSO in Japan, and UHTV broadcasting and its technology, transmission, and devices. And our guest speaker is Mr. Masayuki Takada. He's the senior research engineer from NHK. May I invite Mr. Takada to the stage, please?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for introduction for me. My name is Masayuki Takada from NHK, Japan Broadcasting Corporation. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk about the effort made in Japan to achieve analog switch off in this conference. Today, I will explain our effort, which spanned more than 10 years to prepare for the analog switch off. Before I talk about ASO in Japan, I will explain NHK and Japanese DTTB system, ISDBT. At first, I will introduce NHK briefly. I will introduce terrestrial network broadcasters in Japan. NHK has 2 channels for terrestrial, and there are 5 commercial broadcasters in Tokyo. They have networks all over Japan. 96% of NHK's income is funded by receiving fees, and the commercial broadcasters' income is funded by TV commercials. NHK has 4 TV channels. 2 channels are terrestrial, remaining 2 channels are satellite. And we have 2 AM radio and 1 FM radio channel. Terrestrial TV are GTV and ETV. GTV is NHK's main channel. It provides mainly news, documentary, dramas, and so on for 24 hours. ETV is educational channel. NHK broadcasts HD TV programs in these old TV channels all the time. NHK started AM radio broadcasting in 1925 and TV broadcasting in 1953. This year is 60-year TV anniversary. There are 52 million households in Japan. In almost all households, they can watch NHK's TV program. There are 10,000 NHK employees and 54 stations across Japan and 30 bureaus worldwide. NHK broadcasts TV programs not only in Japan, but also in the world. Next, I will explain features of ISDB system and its background for developing the system. There are 3 objectives for the conversion from analog to digital in Japan. One is to achieve high-quality broadcast service, such as HDTV and data broadcasting. Another is to use frequency more efficiently, reducing 1/3 of the frequency band used for television services. And the other is to create a positive impact on other industries, such as TV manufacturers, retailers, content production companies, internet and mobile companies. ISDBT was developed in NHK laboratories, and it is one of the DTTB systems in the world. ISDBT is a flexible system and robust transmission system. 15 countries all over the world adopt ISDBT system. This slide shows outline of ISDBT transmission from TV station to the receivers. The ISDBT signal can be received not only home receivers, but also handheld mobile receivers. Major unique feature of ISDBT is ISDBT can transmit not only HDTV broadcasting signal to the fixed receivers, but also one signal to the handheld mobile receivers simultaneously in one TV channel. From the point of mobile and handheld TV service, one thing mobile TV service is very cost-effective because it can commonly use all transmission equipment for the fixed reception DTTV system. This slide shows features and current services of ISDBT. ISDBT has a wide variety of applications. For example, HDTV broadcasting, multi-SDTV broadcasting, one thing for mobile TV service, data broadcasting, interactive service using internet, and broadcasting service to the mobile receivers. These services are all realized and operated in Japan. Moreover, mobile TV service is very popular in Japan. Next, I will explain an overview of our effort for the analog switch-off. We spent more than 10 years to prepare for the analog switch-off. This slide shows the television broadcast frequency allocation in Japan with a complete conversion to digital. In 2010, a total of 26 VHF and UHF channels or 370 MHz frequency band were allocated for analog and digital television. In July 2011, all analog transmitters from high power to low power were switched off, and VHF channels 1 to 12, totaling 70 MHz of VHF band, were cleared. Channels 53 to 62 can be used temporarily for digital broadcast until July 2012, just 1 year after the analog switch-off, and are moved into the channels ranging from 13 to 52. This is called channel repacking. Currently, digital TV occupies only 40 channels from 13 to 52, or 240 MHz frequency band, which means that more than 1/3 of the radio frequency are allocated to new services such as mobile phones and other uses. Now, I'll explain the history of the Japanese digital migration. First, in July 2001, the radio law was amended to terminate analog TV in 2011. Digital terrestrial broadcasting started in 2003. One-cell TV services for mobile receivers started in 2006. And analog broadcasting ended in July 2011. NHK and commercial TV broadcasters were responsible for the transmission, including facility arrangement. NHK constructed more than 2,100 transmitting stations for digital. To receive digital services, the viewers needed to replace their analog TV with a digital TV, or get a digital tuner to be used with analog TV set. To promote the transition, the government and NHK provided financial and technical support to viewers in cases where there are some difficulties. Notification to viewers was mainly done through open caption announcements made by the broadcasters. I will talk more about these activities later on. First, I'll give a general overview of the situation in Japan. Termination of analog broadcasting in Japan was carried out with basically no social disorder. This assessment is based on the number of calls received at the digital TV call center. As you can see from the chart, there was a peak on July 24th, the day analog broadcasting was switched off, but it decreased rapidly afterwards. Next, I will describe the initiatives taken with respect to transmission. This chart shows how high the frequency congestion is in Japan compared to the US. The frequency congestion is about 80 times higher. This makes channel planning in Japan tremendously difficult. 15,000 analog TV channels were used in Japan. However, many new digital TV channels were needed. Thus, before digital station could be built, analog TV channels had to be moved to create space for the digital channels. This was called analog channel conversion or analog to analog conversion. Moreover, SFN techniques made it possible to use the frequency effectively in Japan. This chart shows the expansion of the coverage area by air. In last few years, a total of more than 1,700 stations were built, but it raises the coverage rate by only 1%. While this may seem wasteful, NHK is obliged by law to deliver broadcasters over a wide area that covers the entire country. Currently, 2,124 stations are delivering digital broadcasting services covering 98% of households. This slide shows the state of digital broadcast reception in Japan. More than 4% of all households receive television directly by air, so it is very important to provide coverage by radio waves. As a result of building more than 2,100 stations, the radio area coverage rate has reached approximately 98% of households. 1.6% of households in rural areas are able to receive digital broadcast through the construction of community reception antennas located in places where signals from transmitting stations can be received. However, the remaining 0.4% are not able to receive digital terrestrial broadcast. The population density in these areas is quite low. There are about 10,000 communities in the country that have fewer than 10 households, and it is very difficult and not cost-effective to construct transmitting stations or community reception antennas in these areas. As a temporary measure, digital terrestrial broadcast programs from main stations in Tokyo are being transmitted by satellite to reach these areas. Thus, in 2010, the digital TV coverage ratio reached 100%. Next, I will explain the reception infrastructure. Everyone thought difficulties in the transition to digital, so the government established digital TV support centers in each of the 47 prefectures throughout the country. These support centers provided support by holding orientation meetings for viewers, operating call centers, and making announcements to notify viewers regarding reception of digital television. NHK provided more than 100 engineers to these DTV support centers. Now, I will talk about the activities of the DTV support centers. First is a photograph of the regional explanatory meeting held by the support center. Helping the elderly to understand the transition was an important issue. In addition to holding explanatory meeting, support center staff visited elderly persons' homes in person. A total of 2 million households were visited. Third shows a radio wave measurement vehicle. The use of such vehicle enables measurement of broadcast signal quality to be taken efficiently. Measurement could be taken while driving, and the measurement results were made public. Fourth shows the inside of the DTV call center. The call center advised people on reception and explained various difficulties that might occur in the analog switch off and transition to digital. This slide shows 3 major difficulties of the reception infrastructure. First is conversion from VHF to UHF. In most regions in Japan, analog broadcasting was originally done using both the VHF and UHF band. But it's in some areas, including Tokyo, which was the largest population, the main analog TV stations used only the VHF band. So it was necessary to replace VHF antenna with UHF antennas. This is totally 9.2 million households. Second is community reception in rural areas. In rural areas where signals by air could not be received directly, communication reception antenna has been built for analog broadcasting. These antennas were located in places where signals from transmitting stations could be received. This part of the infrastructure affects approximately 0.8 million households and also needed to be converted to digital. Third is interference caused by building shadows. There are many areas in Japan that require community reception systems because buildings create shadows that block radio waves, which interferes with the reception. The owners of these buildings were required to conduct technical surveys and share the cost of digitalizing these systems. This process affected approximately 8 million households. The government, as well as NHK, provided financial and technical support to help resolve these issues. This chart shows the measures taken to resolve the reception infrastructure problems I just mentioned. First, the VHF to UHF antenna replacement progressed gradually with the spread of digital receivers. Notification of the transition from analog to digital through broadcast was quite effective. In the rural area programs, a lot of progress was made in changing the community antenna reception to digital, which was a target to complete the construction so that the viewers can have time to prepare for the analog switch-off. This work was financially supported by the government and NHK. Third, rapid progress was made over the last year in eliminating the interference caused by building shadows. Again, the technical and financial support of the government and NHK were very effective. As a result, the radio of the reception infrastructure that had been converted to digital increased rapidly, especially in the period starting 1 year before the analog switch-off, and finally reached nearly 100%. The government also provided assistance in purchasing digital receivers. Digital tuner and antenna were delivered free of charge to 1.5 million low-income households. Also, an incentive program involving Eco Points was introduced to reward customers for purchasing eco-friendly products, including digital TVs. Eco Point could be exchanged for a coupon, so it is a kind of a rebate or cashback program. The amount of Eco Point depends on the size of the TV and the energy efficiency of product. For example, buying a TV larger than 46 inches results in $450 point. As a result of these measures, this dissemination of digital television increased steadily. The graph on the left shows that by December 2010, the ratio of households processing a digital TV had reached the target of 95%. By July 2011, 123 million digital receivers had been sold. The blue line represents the transition target in the initial plan. As you can see, we are able to achieve our goals as planned. Next, I will discuss the notification and announcement activities. Ultimately, the most effective means of promoting the termination of analog television is by broadcasting it on analog television. Three years before the analog switch-off, the word analog was displayed in the top right corner of the TV screen, because sometimes viewers don't know if they are watching analog TV or digital TV. The number of calls to the call center increased from an average of 400 per day to 600. One year before the termination, the analog screen was converted to a letterbox format with black areas on the top and the bottom. The number of calls doubled from 2,000 to 4,000 per day. Ten months before the switch off, a notice indicating the end of analog broadcasting was displayed below the letter box. The number of calls increased from 4,500 to 11,000. From the 1st of July, 24 days before termination, a countdown notice of the analog switch-off was displayed in the lower left of the image. The number of calls increased from 11,000 to 19,000 per day. Finally, I will discuss the date of termination. From midnight until noon on July 24, a countdown notice was displayed at the lower left side of the image. At noon, the normal program ended, and a blue screen with a final notice was displayed. And at midnight, analog broadcasting was terminated, and the power of the main transmitters was shut down. This shows the changes in the number of calls received at the DTB Support Center and NHK call centers. The number of calls peaked on the last day, but it decreased rapidly after that. It slowed down, and we received about 500 calls per day, mostly regarding how to set up the receiver set. So, analog broadcasting has ended with no significant confusion in Japan. As shown here, various stakeholders in Japan worked on various aspects of the transition to digital for viewers. The stakeholders participated actively and cooperated closely to support the transition, enabling it to be completed without incident. Broadcasters took responsibility of not only building transmitting stations, but also in promoting the digital transition. Manufacturers, retailers, and cable TV companies took a very important role in promoting digital TV as well. The government and NHK prepared several plans to solve difficulties and provided both financial and technical support. The completion of terrestrial digitization marks the starting point of developing a new digital broadcasting medium. The conversion of television to digital increased its compatibility with the internet and other communication media. In the future, broadcast service will actively incorporate communications in order to expand and provide more convenience for viewers. NHK will continue to contribute to future broadcast technologies through hybridcast, which links broadband and communication services, and super high vision, which increase resolution over the current HDTV and the 3D TV system, which viewers can enjoy without needing special glasses. Thank you for your kind attention.
ค่ะไม่ทราบท่านใดมีคำถามหรือเปล่าคะ Is there any questions for our guest speakers? If not, I would like to thank you, Mr. Takada, very much. ก็ขอขอบพระคุณท่านวิทยากรเป็นอย่างสูงนะคะแล้วก็ขอประทานโทษนะคะก็ยังมีอีกหัวข้อหนึ่งนะคะ I don't think there is any questions. Please, Mr. Takada, would you please just proceed the presentation? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is it all right to start next topic? Yeah, thank you. Next one is another topic of my presentation. Super high vision public screening of London Olympics and development of next generation ISDBT system. I will introduce two topics in this my presentation. One is a joint project of the BBC and NHK on public screening of the London Olympics last year by Super High Vision or 8K Ultra HD TV. The other is development of next generation ISDBT system and the field transmission test. This is content of my presentation. Firstly, I will introduce outline of SHV, Super High Vision. Then I will explain public screening of London Olympics last year. And then I will show you roadmap for 4K, 8K satellite broadcasting in Japan. And next, I will introduce a next generation ISDBT system developed in NHK laboratories. I will explain it by introduction video file. And finally, I'll summarize my presentation. Super High Vision, or 8K UHD TV, has 33 million pixels in one frame, which is 16 times that of HD TV. And the sound system for production and broadcasting is 22.2 multi-channel. We can enjoy the stunning image of Super High Vision. I'm sure that we can provide viewers with a totally new viewing experience by Super High Vision. As a broadcaster, our target is to provide super high vision broadcasting service to home in the near future. This slide shows subjective test result of sense of realness and sense of being there against field of view and viewing distance. As a video resolution, 2K HD TV, 4K, and 8K were compared. Higher the resolution, higher the sense of realness. And wider the field of view, higher the sense of being there. 8K UHD TV, we call super high vision, can provide higher sense of realness and being there with a wide field of viewing angle. Let me talk about important topic related to super high vision. That is ITR recommendation BT 2020 that has been agreed by all ITR countries. Existing ITR recommendations have been based on ITR recommendation BT 709, which is a production standard for HD TV. But since we had been considering a video system beyond HD TV, we thought that all parameters should be reviewed as a next-generation television production standard. The result of the intensive studies at ITR is a recommendation BT 2020. This recommendation includes a frame rate of 120 Hz that enable high-quality motion rendition and wide color gamut. It was adopted at the end of July last year. And I believe this is a great achievement for the future super high vision program production and broadcasting. I talk about public screening of London Olympics. I'm sure that everybody in this room would agree that broadcasting technology has developed in parallel with the Olympics. Here is a slide on the progress of broadcast technologies at Olympic Games. In 1948, at the Second London Olympics, viewers saw the Olympics on home television for the first time. It was a great accomplishment by the BBC. About 2 decades later, NHK broadcast the 1964 Tokyo Olympics in color, which was also the first. And the first international transmission of HD TV was conducted during the Seoul Olympics in 1988. And a signal was fed to the public streaming site in Tokyo. And last summer, at the London Olympics, the BBC Olympics Broadcast Service and NHK carried out the first super high vision public screening in United Kingdom, in the United States, and in Japan. And we are planning to launch test broadcasting of SHV in 2016. Here is examples of the super high vision production equipment we used for the Olympic Games. This is a camera used for the production, and it was a third generation of super high vision camera. The weight was 20 kilograms. Currently, we developed next generation camera. The weight of that is just 4 kilograms. These examples of SHV production equipment used for the Olympic Games. the 8-channel switcher, the slow motion system, and 2 P2 recorders were installed into an OB van. And 85-inch super high vision display was used at BBC Studio for post-production. Now, here is an outline of super high vision public screening during London 2012. Video signals from the production site were sent to the BBC studio, where they were edited and transmitted to public screening site in UK, USA, and Japan. International transmission line is gigabit Ether networks, and they were coordinated by NTT of Japan. Here are some photographs taken at a public screening site in Japan. There are 3 screening sites in Tokyo. 2 are located in NHK's site. 1 is a theater with 520-inch screen. And another is 350-inch multi-LCD display located on the tour course for NHK visitors. Since it was summer holiday season, many families visited these 2 screening sites. And the other site in Tokyo was Akihabara, where young people gather. At the Akihabara site, we provided a backyard tour for those who are interested in super high vision technology. This is a result and statistics of public screening. The table shows the number of people who attend the public screenings. In Japan, approximately 200,000 people attended the 3 sites in Tokyo and Fukushima. As the United Kingdom, approximately 20,000 people watched our super high vision. The project was a great success, and this would not have been possible without the close partnership between the BBC, Olympic Broadcast Service, and NHK, and without the dedication of NTT and many equipment manufacturers. This slide shows roadmap for 4K, 8K satellite broadcasting. Next year, 4K test broadcasting are planned in Japan. In 2016, we are planning 8K test broadcasting. And in 2020, we are planning 4K, 8K commercial broadcasting. Next, I will explain the development of next-generation ISDBT transmission system in NHK laboratories and its field transmission test. We are developing this system for transmitting SHV signal throughout terrestrial digital broadcasting system. Television broadcasting service was evolved from HDTV to Ultra HDTV, and terrestrial broadcasting system will also be evolved from ISDBT to the next generation ISDBT to meet the need for increased transmission capacity. About 100 megabps of transmission capacity is needed to transmit super high vision encoded by HEVC video encoding scheme. To increase transmission capacity for the next generation terrestrial broadcasting system, ultra multi-level OFDM technology, dual polarized MIMO technology, and bulk transmission technology are developed and applied to the system. We experimentally manufactured the next generation modulator and demodulator and conducted laboratory and field tests. This slide depicts block diagram of transmission experiments and shows pictures of modulator and demodulator, transmission and reception dual polarized Young antennas. In the laboratory test, IF loopback test and RF loopback test were carried out. In the field test, face-to-face transmission test using the Young antennas were carried out. The transmission power is 1 watt per each polarization, and the transmission distance is about several kilometers. This slide shows transmission parameters of ISDBT-N. 4096 QAM, 32K FFT size, LDPC error correction code, and orthogonal polarized MIMO technologies are introduced to the system. Parameters in red were chosen for field transmission test. Required CN is about 30 dB, and the transmission capacity is 90 Mbps per 6 MHz. So, using two-channel bulk transmission technology, the transmission capacity becomes about 180 Mbps. I will show you the next generation ISDBT introduction video. It's about 5 minutes. In the video, transmission technology, field transmission experiments are introduced. Please play the video.
At the NHK Science and Technology Research Laboratories, we are working to develop a next-generation terrestrial broadcasting system to provide super high vision service using terrestrial waves. Recently, NHK STRL has become the first in the world to transmit a super high vision program using terrestrial waves. First, let us take a look at the large capacity transmission technology used in our prototype system. In addition to ultra-multi-level OFDM technology and dual polarized MIMO technology, which are the subjects of our previous research, our recent prototype system features a new application of bulk transmission using 2 channels with a bandwidth of 6 MHz in the UHF band. By optimizing transmission parameters, such as increasing FFT size to 32 kilo points, we are able to greatly increase transmission capacity. The required CN ratio was further reduced by using a low-density parity check code for forward error correction. The ultra-multi-level OFDM technology expands transmission capacity by increasing the number of signal points to the carrier modulation scheme of each carrier symbol that constitutes an OFDM signal. We succeeded in transmitting 12 bits of data per carrier symbol by expanding the number of signal points in the carrier modulation scheme to 4,096. Meanwhile, the dual polarized MIMO technology doubles the transmission capacity by simultaneously using horizontally and vertically polarized waves within the same channel to transmit different information. For the first time, we introduced interpolarization, interleaving, that makes the transmission characteristics more robust in an environment in which one polarized wave has deteriorated. Next, let us take a look at the field experiment of super high vision transmission using 2 channels with a bandwidth of 6 MHz in the UHF band. First, a compressed coded super high vision transport stream was split into 2 transport streams at the transmission site. The 2 split transport streams were then inputted into 2 prototype modulators, respectively, to produce a horizontally and vertically polarized signal from each of the 2 modulators for a total of 4 signals. The frequency of the 4 modulated signals were then converted to channels 31 and 34 in the UHF band. After the 4 signals were amplified by power amplifiers, multiplexed by an antenna, combiner, and transmitted from a dual polarized antenna mounted on the roof of the NHK STRL building. Meanwhile, at the reception site, one dual polarized Yagi antenna was used to simultaneously receive the horizontally and vertically polarized waves. First, the signals amplified by low-noise amplifiers were converted into intermediate frequency signals using receivers for horizontally and vertically polarized waves. The signals were then demodulated into a transport stream by the prototype demodulators for each channel. Finally, the 2 transport streams were combined into a single stream using a transport stream multiplexer, and the super high vision signal was successfully decoded and displayed without error. The success of the recent tests has brought us one step closer to our goal of super high vision terrestrial broadcasting.
Remaining maybe a few seconds, but it's a video file is finished. Okay, so let me summarize my presentation. I mentioned the outline of super high vision, ITR recommendation, and public screening of London Olympics in last summer. And I explained development of the next generation of ISDBT in NHK laboratories and the field transmission tests of super high vision. We are still developing and improving the next generation of ISDBT transmission system. Henceforth, we will optimize transmission parameters towards realizing next generation of terrestrial broadcasting.